The sea is a mouth, and tonight it learns to speak. Beacon Theta Delta's golden eye sweeps a storm-black horizon, then stutters, dies. On the catwalk, a lone tide warden tastes iron on the wind, and hears chain on rung, rung on steel. And a laugh, too big for a human throat. Midnight blue eclipses the light. The skullface leans in. Vox grills purr. We have come for you. Some screams are warnings. This one is an invitation. Shard-walkers, steel your nerves and step into the wake. If grim sagas from the 41st millennium are your harbor, subscribe to grimdark shards and ring the bell so the next terror finds you first, not unprepared. Support is honored, never demanded. Tributes dwell in the archives below. Now hold your breath. The tide is turning. The ocean world of Ilitha's Reach was always a quiet place. A forgotten rim outpost where tides thundered against basalt cliffs and the Imperium watchtowers jutted up like teeth to gnaw at the endless storm. The lighthouse was not a beacon for ships in the seas below, but for voidcraft above. Its crown was a cyclopean array of auspex and vox magnifias, meant to pierce the dark between stars and keep the trade lanes clear. The civilians who manned it, a few hundred families, generations deep-lived in the shadow of its humming spire. Their lives measured by static-filled broadcasts, supply barges that came once a season, and the rhythmic pounding of the sea against the rock. It was never meant to be anything more than a flicker in the Emperor's vast dominion, a caretaker station whose light burned for others, not itself. On the night the sky broke, that light began to falter. It began with a murmur over the Voxnet. Children sleeping in the hab blocks stirred at the broken whispers of a language their parents did not know. Engineers who worked the array reported phantom signals crawling up through the static, pulses like the distant heartbeat of some unseen leviathan. The chief overseer, Armoric, a gaunt man whose eyes were permanently bloodshot from decades staring at cogitator screens, insisted it was interference from a solar storm. But when they went outside onto the dripping gantries and looked up, they saw the heavens were calm in the way a predator is calm, holding still before the pounce. At first, no one thought of danger. Ilitha's Reach had never been worth a raider's attention. Its oceans offered no great wealth, its station no strategic prize. The families who lived there raised children, repaired machines, prayed at the small chapel of the Emperor, and waited for their supply ships. Even when the signal warped into a scream, jagged across the Vox, the minds of the lighthouse folk reached for explanations that did not include malice. Some thought it was a malfunction in the Auspex mast. Others thought it was a trapped spirit in the machine. Then the lights in the hab tiers began to flicker. The power grid was steady, but shadows moved where they shouldn't. Civilians spoke of hearing boots on metal decks when no patrols were scheduled, of seeing outlines at the edges of lumen light, gaunt shapes that seemed to shiver and vanish when confronted. Mothers drew their children closer at night. Priests whispered longer prayers, and the night tides grew harsher, as though the planet itself knew what was coming. The first clear sign came when the beacon itself shuddered. It dimmed for the space of 3 breaths, and then flared again, throwing its pale light across the cloud-thick skies. Armoric and his engineers tried to correct the fault, but no fault existed. Instead, their Auspex screens bloomed with signatures, Dozens, hundreds, dropships, stabbing down through the void like iron spears. Their hulls were painted with sigils of flayed skin and talons. Their vox cannons carried laughter warped through vox grills. The overseer dropped his stylus, his hands trembling. He had seen enough old records, enough warning bulletins, to know what those colors meant. The Night Lords had come. Panic erupted as the truth spread. The Habtiers, once filled with weary comfort, became a cacophony of screaming voices and slamming doors. Families gathered what little they could, though there was nowhere to flee. The docking bays held only a few rusted transports, none void-worthy enough to break atmosphere, let alone reach the safety of an Imperial patrol. Men and women ran through dripping corridors, clutching children to their chests, while priests shouted over the din that the Emperor's light would not abandon them. But their eyes betrayed their terror. Everyone knew what the Night Lords were. Not conquerors, not occupiers, terror itself, given human shape. The first landings hit the cliffs below, shaking stone and rattling gantries. The thunder of retro thrusters was drowned out by the primal roar of the sea. But through the fog and spray, the civilians saw the outlines of monstrous figures disembark. 8 feet tall, armored in midnight ceramite, their pauldrons crowned with spikes, their helms wrought into sneering bat-faced visages. Some bore wings of tattered leather, some dragged chains, heavy with hooks and skulls. The Vox howled, with a dozen distorted voices speaking at once, as if each warrior carried the echoes of all those he had slaughtered. The defenders were not. Soldiers merely had security with flak vests and battered lasrifles. They tried to form a cordon at the main causeway leading up to the lighthouse spire, voices shaking as they recited the Emperor's litany. The civilians watched from windows and gantries, their hearts hammering as the first volley of lost fire split the night. Thin red beams stabbed into the fog, striking armored giants who did not even slow. The Night Lords returned fire with a contemptuous sweep of bolters, and the front line vanished in wet thunder. Bodies shredded into a haze of blood and smoke. The survivors broke. Some ran back toward the Habs, some fell to their knees in the mud, others simply screamed and screamed. The Night Lords advanced, methodical, their laughter crawling through the voxnets, into every room, every corridor. Even those who had not seen them felt the psychic pressure of predators who thrived on fear. Mothers pressed hands over their children's ears, but the laughter seeped through steel and stone. The beacon tower itself seemed to hum with it, as though the invaders' malice had seeped into its very bones. Armoric and a handful of engineers sealed themselves in the control chamber, trying to send a distress call. Fingers flew across consoles, desperate prayers to the machine's spirit, but every channel was already flooded with the enemy's vox. The message that went out into the void was not a plea for help, but a scream, looped endlessly, modulated until it was indistinguishable from laughter. Somewhere in the chamber, a young tech adept began to sob, tearing at his augmetic eyes, insisting he could see them even with his lids shut. Cargo crates, overturned machinery, welding torches used to fuse doors shut. The chapel filled with terrified souls who clutched rosaries and icons, their voices rising in frantic hymn. But the Night Lords did not batter down doors like blunt marauders. They let the civilians hear them first, boots dragging against metal, claws tapping in rhythm, whispers over the vox that imitated the voices of lost loved ones. A father opened a sealed hatch when he thought he heard his daughter's cry on the other side, only to be cut down by a chain blade as the laughing killers spilled in. His real daughter was 3 rooms away, listening to his death scream echo through the ducts. Above it all, the beacon burned. It flickered, sputtered, but did not die. Its light swept across the storming sea, across the blood-wet cliffs, and into the starless night sky. From far away, it would look like nothing more than an old station going about its work. But inside, its people were being unmade, their lives flayed apart, not just by blades, but by the theater of fear. The Night Lords killed slowly when they could, dragging survivors into the open, hanging them from the gantries with their own cables, cutting the skin from their faces and letting the storm winds howl through their exposed skulls. Every death was a message, every scream a signal. For those still hiding, time lost meaning. Hours stretched into eternities of whispered dread, broken by sudden shrieks and the pounding of armored boots. The civilians huddled in darkness, holding each other, waiting for the inevitable scrape of claws against their doors. In the hoblocks, families whispered prayers over and over until the words lost all meaning. In the chapel, the hymns broke down into sobbing and silence as the air grew thick with the stench of blood, and always the beacon burned. It was a cruel joke, a light meant to guide, now a lure for horror. To the Imperium, it would look alive and healthy. To the stars beyond, it still kept its duty. But inside, its people were already lost. The Night Lords had turned it into a stage, and its citizens into actors, in a play of terror that would echo far beyond the tides of Ilitha's reach, somewhere in the upper spire. In a room filled with broken machinery and the whimpering of dying men, a vox recording stuttered to life. The voice was human, cracked and frantic, repeating into the void. This is Flayed Beacon. To any who hear, we are not alone. They are inside the dock. The signal repeated, again and again. The signal echoed through the void, but no one aboard the lighthouse station believed it would bring salvation. The words that spilled from the vox were already contaminated, already warped. Some of the civilians huddled in the hablocks swore that when they heard the message, it wasn't the overseer's voice at all, but their own, pleading from some future death they had not yet met. Others claimed the signal had no words at all, only the wet sound of laughter stretched into infinity. Still, the beacon pulsed outward, faithful as always, like a blind man crying into a storm. Inside the station, the screams had not ceased. The Night Lords did not simply kill. They harvested. They wanted terror, and terror required time. Whole groups were rounded up from the hab tiers and driven with herding prods up toward the gantries. Mothers clutched their children as the towering armored giants loomed above them, visors gleaming, wings unfurling in ragged silhouette. The air reeked of promethium and blood, of oil dripping from chain blades. In the spray of the storm below, the first bodies were flung into the sea knot, slain cleanly, but torn apart and cast piece by piece into the black waters, so that their kin could hear the waves churning with their blood. On the upper decks, Armoric tried again to fight for control. His hands shook on the cogitator runes, every nerve screaming with exhaustion. His engineers were broken things now, muttering or gibbering, some clawing at their own faces to drive out voices only they could hear. He remembered his family down in the hab blocks, remembered his wife's soft smile, his son's quiet laugh. He could not allow himself to think of them, because, if he thought of them, he would have to admit they were already gone. Duty was all he had left, and duty meant keeping the beacon lit. No matter what else failed, please, he rasped, not even sure to whom he prayed. Machine spirit, emperor, anyone, let someone hear us. The Auspex array stuttered back at him with lines of distorted runes. For a brief, searing second, he thought he saw the ping of an approaching Imperial frigate. Hope flared, and then the ping warped into jagged symbols, strings of flayed script that no human tongue could speak. From the vox emitter above the console, laughter spilled, low and guttural, mocking his hope. Armoric fell to his knees, hands over his ears, but the laughter was inside his skull now, reverberating against bone. He screamed until his voice broke, and still the laughter kept him company, down in the chapel. The survivors, still kneeling in desperate prayer, realized too late that their sanctuary was no refuge. The heavy doors shuddered once, twice, before splitting inward. The icons of the Emperor rattled on the walls as armored giants stalked in, their eyes burning like furnaces behind horned helms. The priest leading the hymn did not falter, even as chainblades whirred and bolters roared. He raised his voice higher, every note a desperate plea. In his light we shall not falter. In his arms we shall not. The words ended in a gout of blood as a talon burst through his chest, lifting him into the air. The Night Lord that held him tilted its head, savoring the look of horror that rippled through the congregation, before flinging the priest's body against the altar so hard it shattered into splinters. The hymn turned into screams. Children were dragged out first, their shrieks magnified through corrupted vox speakers so that every corner of the station heard their terror. Parents followed, clawing at armored warriors with bare hands, only to be cast aside like insects. The Night Lords did not kill them quickly. They wanted every soul to know that the Emperor's light had abandoned them here, that no prayer could stop the dark on the gantries. One of the civilians, a young woman named Kelrine, managed to slip free in the chaos. She ran barefoot across the metal decking, lungs burning, heart hammering, her ears full of the pounding sea. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Behind her, a distorted voice whispered her name through the vox grid. Kelrine. Kelrine. It was her brother's voice. But her brother had been dead for years, drowned in the ocean storms when they were children. She stumbled into a maintenance shaft and crawled until her hands bled, the metal scraping her knees. She emerged in a storage bay, dark and half-flooded. The reflection of the beacon's light shimmered through the water, pooled on the deck, like a star trying to guide her. She wanted to believe that meant something, that the Emperor still watched. But when she leaned closer, she saw that her reflection in the water was smiling when she was not. A shadow passed over her. She turned, too late. Talons clamped around her throat and lifted her into the air. The last thing she saw, before the world went black, was the leering helm of a Night Lord. Its fox grill hissing laughter that was almost human, almost kind, and all the more terrible for it. In the control chamber above, Armoric finally broke. His bloodied hands hovered over the console, the laughter still filling every channel. He knew the beacon could not save them, not truly. but it could warn others. With the last of his strength, he forced the machine spirit to repeat the message, again and again, endless in its loop. He didn't know if the words were his anymore. They sounded warped, wrong, stretched thin, but it didn't matter. The message carried one final truth. Please, help. We are not alone. He is in the dark. And as the Night Lords stormed the chamber, their wings blotting out the lumen strips, Armoric looked into their eyes and saw nothing but joy at his terror. He tried to pray, but his voice failed him. The beacon flared one last time, casting his shadow long across the floor, before his scream joined all the others echoing in the dark. The light of the beacon still burned, faithful as ever. But now it was no longer a warning. It was a lure. The storm did not ease with dawn. If anything, the gray light of morning only revealed how truly cursed the horizon had become. From the colony on the main isle, those awake and watching saw the sea itself flicker with unnatural hues, as though lightning coiled beneath the waves. The beacon that should have cut through fog and rain lay silent, its light extinguished. All that remained were faint sparks, and, at intervals, strange pulses of crimson that did not belong to any Imperial lumen. In Breakers Point Harbor, Captain Veronholt leaned heavily against the trawler's wheelhouse. He had not slept since the first fragments of the Vox call broke through in the small hours. Static, a scream, then a phrase that did not sound like Holden's voice. At all we have come for you. He could still hear it now, ghosting the inside of his skull. He had tried to convince himself it was storm interference, but his gut told him otherwise. And Holt had learned never to ignore his gut. The harbor master's office stank of damp parchment and recalf gone stale. Luron, the harbor master, fussed with reports, but his hands shook, betraying what his mouth would not admit. Beacon Theta Delta went dark at 0200, he said, voice hoarse. Holden's a stubborn bastard. He wouldn't leave his post unless something forced him. And that message you heard. His eyes flicked up, lined with fear. You really think it was him? Holt rubbed the scar along his jaw, the one a heretic's blade had left decades ago. It was Haldenor, what was left of him. Either way, it wasn't a joke. Something's wrong out there. I'll take the grace. He straightened, shoulders heavy but resolute. If Holden's alive, he deserves a rescue. If not, then at least we'll know what we're dealing with. Luron opened his mouth, but before he could argue, the door creaked and Captain Severin stepped in. Rain plastered his dark hair flat against his skull, his flak greatcoat dripping. His expression was grim as stone. I'll be sending 2 of my men with you, he announced. Troopers, Markin and Gren, young, but steady hands. You'll want rifles along if this is more than just a storm-downed power line. Holt met his gaze. Both men had worn Imperial uniforms once, and though Holt's soldiering days had long since given way to nets and harpoons, the look in Severin's eyes was familiar. Neither of them believed this was routine. By the time the Grace nosed out of the harbor, morning rain had turned to sheets of mist. Waves slapped the hull with hungry rhythm, and the trawler's engines groaned against the pull of the tide. Thomas Holt's young deckhand moved quickly across the slick boards, his hands tightening knots that didn't need tightening just to keep busy. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. Holt recognized the look. Fear, held down by sheer will. He clapped the boy's shoulder as he passed. You stay sharp, Holt said. "This won't be like fishing runs. Keep that lantern dry. When we get close, light will be worth more than any blade." The PDF troopers sat near the bow, rifles clutched in nervous hands. Markin, stocky with a soldier's blunt face, gave Holt a nod of acknowledgement. Gren was younger, thinner, eyes darting to every wave as though the ocean itself might reach for him. Holt didn't blame him. The sea around Cortusa had swallowed many in silence. The beacon loomed out of fog without warning. One moment there was only gray. The next, the tower was there, scarred, blackened, its crown shattered. The great lumen that should have swept its golden light across the waters was a broken husk, sparks fizzing weakly in the rain. Holt throttled down, the Grace rocking on the chop by the throne. Severin muttered. His hand drifted to his pistol. The ladder that scaled the tower's flank was twisted. Rungs bent as if something enormous had climbed it. Jagged black gouges scored the plascrete walls. The service dock was half submerged, but still intact enough for the trawler to moor. Holt guided her in close, teeth clenched, until Thomas leaped across with a rope and tied them fast. The group disembarked, boots slipping on Alja's lick stone. The stair-up to the main hatch rose ahead, narrow and wet. Holt led the way, carbine slung across his back, lantern in hand. He could feel the air change as they ascended the heavy stillness that settles after great violence. Like a battlefield where the dead have not yet cooled, at the top, the hatch gaped inward. It had not been forced open with explosives. There were no scorch marks, no melted edges. No, this door had been ripped free. Its hinges lay scattered like snapped bone. Severin gestured silently, and Markin took rear guard, rifle steady. Holt stepped inside first, lantern beams slicing through the gloom. The sight stopped him cold. The control chamber was a slaughterhouse. Consoles had been shredded as if with claws the size of scythes. The walls dripped with dried arcs of blood, dark and clotted. The stench of copper and ozone hung thick. In the corner lay an arm, torn from the shoulder, sleeve still bearing the reflective stripe of a beacon keeper's uniform. The hand clutched a broken Las pistol. Thomas gagged behind him, nearly dropping the lantern. Holt's stomach turned, but he forced himself forward. Near the Vox console, something was smeared on the wall. He lifted the light. Blood, painted in broad strokes, had formed a crude star 8 points, radiating outward. Not Imperial, not pirate. Something far older, far worse. Holt's breath caught. He remembered Veridon for the cult wars. The shrines daubed with that same heretical mark. "Chaos, Captain," he whispered, voice dry as sand. "Look." Severin's face went pale beneath the lantern's glow. He traced the star's edge with his eyes, lips tightening. "The arch enemy," he said, voice iron-hard, despite the tremor beneath it. "This isn't smugglers. This is worse." Before Holt could answer, Markin's voice called from outside. "Serzial want to see this." They hurried back onto the platform. The storm had thinned to drizzle, but the sky was a solid sheet of iron. Markin was pointing upward, face stricken. Holt followed his gesture, raising the lantern. Atop the mast, something pale fluttered in the wind. For a moment, Holt thought it was canvas, a tarp caught on the antenna. Then lightning flashed, and his gut turned to ice. It was skin. Human skin, stretched and nailed into the shape of a mock Aquila, its ragged edges dripping rain. Scraps of gray fabric clung to it. A beacon keeper's uniform. Holden's uniform. Thomas cried out in horror, covering his face. Gren stumbled to the railing and retched over the edge. Markin crossed himself, muttering, "Emperor, preserve us." Severin's jaw tightened to stone. "Form up," he snapped. "We're not alone here." Holt's hand closed around Holden's ident tag, sticky with blood. He slipped it into his pocket, a vow forming in his chest. The Night Lords had come to Kurtusa. He had heard the stories in the Guard, the whispered campfire terrors of the 8th Legion, masters of fear. He had never believed he'd face them himself. But now, as the skin of his friend fluttered above, he knew the truth. Terror had come out of the tides and breakers. Point was next. The sea was waiting for them when they descended the slick stairs to the service dock. Holt could feel it, the oppressive silence that lay between each gust of wind, as if the ocean itself held its breath. He had fought men before, fought rebels and raiders, even beasts with too many teeth that came up from Corchus's abyssal trenches. But this was different. This was the sense of being hunted. Thomas scrambled to untie the lines, his hands fumbling more than usual. Holt caught the boy's wrist, steadying him. "Easy, keep your head." Thomas nodded quickly, but his eyes were still fixed on the mast high above, where Holden's skin twitched in the drizzle like some obscene banner. They boarded in silence. Severin was already speaking into his vox bead, his voice low and clipped. "Janus, copy. Confirm Beacon Theta, Delta compromised. Keeper Holden is deceased. Heavy signs of arch-enemy involvement. Possible Astartes traitor presence. Breaker's Point is at risk. Raise alert status to maximum." Static fizzled back at him, broken words, half swallowed by interference. Severin cursed under his breath and tried again. But Holt already knew the truth. The Night Lords were jamming communications. They wanted breakers, point blind and afraid. The engines coughed to life with a belch of smoke. Holt eased the throttle forward, guiding the Grace back into the open water. Mist closed around them, and the tower vanished behind gray curtains. For a moment, Holt allowed himself to hope that perhaps they had been quick enough that whatever butchered Holden and defiled the beacon had already moved on. Then came the first impact. A deep clang reverberated through the hull, so heavy it rattled the teeth in Holt's skull. The Grace shuddered, her deck tilting underfoot. Gren yelped and swung his rifle to the starboard side. "Something hit us." Another impact followed, louder, closer, shaking the whole vessel. Metal screeched as though claws dragged along the keel. The boy Thomas staggered into the wheelhouse, face white. "Captain, it's under us." Holt's pulse hammered. He threw the wheel hard, turning the trawler into the swell, trying to steady her. "Weapons ready," he bellowed. The PDF troopers scrambled, rifles raised, eyes sweeping the fog-shrouded waves. Severin drew his last pistol, his jaw like carved stone. The sea erupted. A shadow burst from the water in a spray of foam and shattered wood. It landed on deck with a crash that shook the vessel to its bones. For one frozen heartbeat, Holt could only stare. It was a giant towering, clad in midnight blue ceramite, trimmed with brass, every plate scarred by war. Its skull-faced helm dripped with seawater, crimson lenses burning like coals in the mist. Lightning claws hissed to life in its gauntlets, each talon sparking with caged fury. A Night Lord, Gren screamed and opened fire. Red lost bolts slashed across the giant's armor. But they did nothing, at best, leaving black scorch marks, at worst, ricocheting uselessly into the sea. The Night Lord moved faster than Holt thought possible for something so large. A single sweep of its claws tore Gren apart, the boy's body collapsing in halves, blood gushing across the deck. Thomas cried out, falling back, his hands slick with his comrade's gore. "Light him up," Holt roared. He snapped his carbine to his shoulder, firing burst after burst. Markin joined him, his own rifle blazing. The air strobed with light, the deck filled with the hiss and crack of lost fire. The traitor staggered under the barrage, but he did not fall. A distorted chuckle leaked from his vox grill, mocking, savoring. Then his bolter came up. The first shot tore Markin's chest open in a shower of blood and armor fragments. The second blew apart the wheelhouse door, shredding it into splinters. Holt felt the passage of the shell whistle past his head. He threw himself into cover behind a coil of thick rope, teeth clenched, ears ringing. "Severin," he bellowed. The captain was crouched near the stern with Thomas, firing disciplined double taps at the giant's helm. "Keep him busy," Severin shouted. He ripped a frag grenade from his belt, thumbed the activator, and hurled it at the Night Lord's feet. The explosion turned the deck into a storm of fire and shrapnel. The giant staggered back against the railing, smoke pouring from the rents in his armor. One crimson lens cracked, revealing a bloodshot eye beneath, full of malice. A barbed harpoon jutted from his side, the spear Thomas had thrown in blind desperation. Lodging in the gap beneath his pauldron, for the first time, Holt heard a sound he had not expected. The Night Lord growled in pain. "Now," Holt roared. He scrambled to the stern, hands flying over the anchor winch. With a screech of gears, he loosed the chain. The massive anchor dropped free, its weight dragging the chain across the deck. The Night Lord turned just as Holt slammed the lever, locking the winch. The chain snapped taut, whipping around the giant's greaves with a sound like thunder. The Night Lord bellowed, staggering, claws flashing. Holt jammed the motor forward. The winch howled, the chain tore, tightened. The giant was yanked off his feet, dragged across the slick boards. With one final snarl, he toppled over the railing and plunged into the sea. "Thomas, cut it," Holt barked. The boy scrambled forward, eyes wide, and slammed the release. The chain rattled, thundered, then went slack as it vanished beneath the waves. Anchor and traitor alike, tumbling into the abyss. For a long moment, the only sound was the ragged breathing of the survivors and the hiss of rain on the deck. Holt kept his carbine trained on the churning water, waiting, praying. At last, only a thin swirl of dark blood bubbled to the surface. Then even that was gone. Thomas staggered to Holt's side, face pale, eyes wide. Did we kill him? Holt stared at the foamy water, heart hammering. The image of Holden's flayed skin still burned into his mind. He gripped the boy's shoulder, forcing his own voice steady. "We bought ourselves time. That's all that matters." Severin limped forward, one arm slick with blood from shrapnel wounds, his expression grim. "If one of them was here," he said, voice hoarse, "there will be more." Holt nodded, staring into the mist. The beacon had been their warning. Breaker's Point was next. The Grace limped through the gray swells, her hull cracked and bleeding smoke. The storm had begun to lift, but the sea seemed no gentler for its every wave slapping hard against the scarred vessel like a reprimand from the abyss itself. Holt kept both hands on the wheel, his knuckles white as bone. Each time the deck groaned, he thought of the Night Lord's weight upon it, his claws raking across the boards. The smell of blood still lingered, iron-rich and sickly. Thomas sat slumped against the bulkhead, his hands still trembling, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the deck. Gren's blood spattered his tunic, soaking into the fabric. He hadn't spoken since they'd dragged Gren's remains into a weighted tarp and slid it into the sea. Holt knew that silence knew it from campaign after campaign. It was the silence of a boy who had seen the world end in an instant, and had not yet found words to build another. Severin leaned against the stern rail, blood trickling from a cut at his temple, his posture iron-stiff despite the pain. His vox unit sputtered in his hand, static spilling like whispers from a dying throat. "No signal," he muttered. "Every channel jammed. They're cutting us off, isolating us." "Which means," Holt said, eyes fixed on the horizon, "Breaker's Point doesn't know what's coming." The thought sat heavy in his gut. Breaker's Point was not just a lighthouse and a garrison, it was families, hundreds of them, miners and fishers, who had clung to this rock of an island for generations. They had no defense against Astartes traitors. Even the PDF here were barely trained, half of them little better than militiamen. Against the Night Lords, they would last minutes. A gull shrieked overhead, circling the mast, and Holt almost envied it. It could fly far from this cursed coast. They could not. "Look," Thomas whispered suddenly. He was pointing eastward, through the thinning mist. The outline of Breaker's Point rose jagged cliffs, bristling with fortifications. The smokestacks of its manufactorum belching gray into the sky. The clustered rooftops of the civilian quarter huddled beneath the watch of the curtain wall. And above it all, proud and solitary, the signal spire loomed, its vox mast stabbing toward the heavens like a prayer made iron. For a moment, Holt felt a flicker of relief. They had made it. They could warn them. They could then. The spire flared red, not the steady, rhythmic blink of a warning beacon, not the white strobe of routine navigation. This was a pulse like a heartbeat, crimson and furious, painting the clouds in brief, blood-colored bursts. Emergency signal, distress. Severin's jaw clenched. "They're already here." The words landed like blows. Holt pulled the Grace hard toward the harbor channel, the vessel straining against the turn. Even before they entered the bay, the sound reached them, a low, rolling thunder that did not belong to any storm. It was the percussion of guns, heavy, disciplined, merciless. Breaker's Point was under siege. As the Grace nosed into the bay, the truth came into view. Plumes of fire rose from the outer defenses where auto-cannon nests once stood. The air was thick with smoke and the Thames of promethium. Along the walls, flashes of LAs and stub fire stuttered against advancing shadows, far larger than men. Holt saw them through the haze. Giants in cobalt armor stalked the avenues, their helms crowned with lightning motifs, their crimson eyes gleaming through the fire. Night Lords, a squad at least, perhaps more. Each movement was measured cruelty, each kill deliberate. Civilians ran screaming across the plazas, only to be gunned down or dragged into the dark. Holt's stomach twisted. It wasn't war, it was slaughter. Thomas gagged, one hand over his mouth. Thrown. We're too late. No. Holt's voice was rough, but it carried iron. Not too late. As long as one soul still breathes, we fight. We get word out, whatever it costs. He jammed the throttle forward. The Grace surged toward the docks, her horn bellowing once, twice an animal cry of defiance. Along the quay, figures turned, waving them in. PDF troopers, bloodied but alive, dragging civilians behind. Barricades of crates and sandbags. Bolter fire tore the air as the Night Lords shifted toward the commotion. One raised a launcher and sent a missile screaming toward the harbor. Holt hauled the wheel hard over. The rocket detonated in the water, a wall of spray hammering the trawler sideways. Holt fought the wheel, swearing, teeth grinding. The Grace slammed into the dock with bone-rattling force, ropes snapping, wood splintering. Holt barked, leaping onto the quay. He hauled Thomas by the collar, dragging him after. Severin stumbled off behind Laspistol, spitting red bolts to cover their retreat. Holt grabbed a PDF trooper's rifle from his hands and fired blindly into the smoke, forcing shadows back. The dock was chaos, civilians screaming, children wailing, soldiers bleeding from ragged wounds. The smell of charred flesh clung to every breath, and above it all, the beacon pulsed its red heartbeat, a desperate cry to a galaxy that might never hear. Holt turned to Severin. Command post. The captain pointed toward the inner gate, where a cluster of officers struggled to rally a defense. There. If the Vox isn't dead, it's there. Holt nodded grimly. Then that's where we make our stand. The courtyard of Breaker's Point was choking with fire and screams. Holt shoved through the mob of fleeing miners and fisherfolk, dragging Thomas by the wrist, Severin limping close behind. Bolter fire cracked like thunder, cutting down men and women who scattered like hunted prey. Every detonation shook the earth beneath their boots, and the air reeked of promethium and blood. The inner gate was a bottleneck, half shattered by explosives, its iron doors hanging askew. Around the breach, a knot of PDF officers fought desperately to maintain order, lasguns flashing against the shadows that advanced with dreadful inevitability. Holt forced his way through, shoving a boy into the arms of a nurse, hauling a collapsed worker to his feet, his voice raw from barking orders. Severin staggered up to a lieutenant, his coat torn, his face ash. Command post. Where? The officer pointed with a shaking hand. Signal Spirevox controls still intact. His words ended in a scream as a bolt round cored his chest, painting the wall behind him red. Move, Holt roared. He shoved Thomas through the gate just as the first Night Lord strode into view. The giant filled the breach, cobalt armor scored with lightning bolts, a chain blade purring in one gauntlet. His Vox grill laughed as he stepped over the lieutenant's body, crimson eyes burning with cruel hunger. The PDF line collapsed. Men scattered, firing wildly, their lasrons sparking harmlessly off. The chain blade came down, carving flesh and bone like straw. Severin emptied his pistol at the monster's face, one shot cracking a lens, another burning into his gorget. The giant staggered, but did not fall. With one brutal swing, he cleaved Severin from shoulder to hip, spraying Holt in a rain of gore. Holt's world narrowed to a howl. He shoved Thomas ahead, forcing him toward the spire, firing until his rifle clicked dry. They bolted up the stairway into the tower, the heartbeat of the beacon pounding around them like the thrum of a dying god. Below, the laughter followed, closer with every breath. They burst into the signal chamber. Machinery filled the room, its consoles flickering, its vox arrays sparking under strain. A lone tech adept was still at his station, his mechadendrites twitching as he slammed keys, whispering prayers of binary desperation. The linkit flicker's eye can reach high orbit. Nothing more. Send it, Holt snarled. Anything. Someone will hear. The adept's fingers danced, and the vox screamed to life, a burst of static. Then a fragment of words spilling into the void. Breaker's Point under assault. Traitor, Emperor's mercy. The door exploded inward. The Night Lord filled the threshold, smoke curling from his armor, his chain blade dripping with the last of Severin's blood. Thomas screamed and raised a lasgun, firing until the pack hissed dry. The bolts burned across the giant's helm, charring one crimson lens black. With a roar, the Night Lord lunged. Holt threw himself between Thomas and the monster, dragging a frag grenade from his belt. He jammed it against the giant's chestplate, locking eyes with that pitiless crimson gaze. For Breaker's Point, he spat. The explosion tore the chamber apart. Metal shrieked, fire roared, the spire's vox array shattered in a rain of sparks. Holt felt himself flung into darkness, every nerve screaming, every bone aflame. When awareness returned, he was on his back, staring at the broken dome above. Smoke curled through shattered beams. The giant lay twisted nearby, armor split open, one claw gone, the other sparking uselessly. His helm was torn aside, revealing a pallid face carved in scars, lips curled in a grin even in death. Thomas crawled to Holt's side, coughing blood. "We did it," he rasped. His eyes were wild, his boy's face streaked with soot and tears. The signal someone herds, someone must have. Below, Breaker's Point burned. The cries of its people echoed up the tower, joined by the harsh laughter of other giants still stalking the streets. Holt knew the truth. They had not won. The colony was dying, piece by piece, torn apart under the Night Lord's shadow. But above, in the void, perhaps some ship had caught their desperate cry. Perhaps the Emperor's servants would come. Perhaps their sacrifice would not vanish into silence. Holt gripped Thomas's shoulder, holding him steady as the tower shuddered. His vision swam, his strength bled away. In the last flicker of consciousness, he thought he saw the beacon's red pulse fade into white pure, defiant. A final light against the dark. Then the night closed over Breaker's Point, and the laughter of the Night Lords echoed like thunder across the sea.